So this video is about Genetics by Sinead Morrissey, and the whole poem is based around a conceit of hands and identity. And Morrissey uses a child's rhyme that you might have had done with you when you were little. And before I move on to the actual poem, I just want to show you the rhyme on camera, otherwise the poem might not make sense. And you might remember it. And it goes, here's the church, there's the steeple, look inside, there's the people. And you might do that with toddlers to kind of make them laugh about the people wiggling around in the church. So hopefully that'll explain one of the stanzas in the poem. But let's have a look at the actual poem now. So Genetics, the poem, is a villanelle. Now a villanelle, in terms of structure, is a poem of 19 lines, and you get 5 tercets, 5 3-line poems, and at the end you get a quatrain, a 4-line stanza. And I think tercets are really interesting in terms of form, because you get this sense of, trio. You got this sense of, maybe 2 people and something else intruding. And in this case, perhaps it's 3 people, because she's talking about the relationship between her parents, but also her parents and herself. So there's 3 of them. Then the quatrain, you get that change of tone because it's 4 lines in the final stanza, and that tends to give a sense of kind of conclusion or closure. Now a villanelle, is a very structured form, and Morrissey uses it to an extent, but she rebels against the structure of the form, if you like, which I think perhaps shows that relationships for her haven't turned out the way that she thought they would or hoped they would. So note that she doesn't always follow the strict villanelle form, because in a villanelle you're supposed to get a repetition of the first and third line, and she does that to an extent, but she breaks out the pattern a little bit. And she also uses a combination of perfect rhyme, where all of the sounds in the word match, like in hands and lines, but she also uses half rhyme, which you don't normally get in a villanelle. Here you might see, for example, using lover and river. It's the end sound, the ver sound, that matches, not the whole thing. So again, that's quite unusual in a villanelle. So it shows that she's rebelling against that formal structure. Now a villanelle is normally associated with obsession. So you would write a villanelle for something that you're obsessing about. And note that she is not obsessed about a lover, but she's obsessed about the relationship between her parents. And the reason that she's obsessed is that her parents have split up, and even as what appears to be an adult commentator, she's very upset by this, so she is dwelling or obsessing on that. Okay, so let's have a look at the first tercet, the first stanza, and she says, my father's in my fingers, but my mother's in my palms. And then you've got there that really visual image that when she looks at her hand, she can see that her fingers look like her dad's, but her palm of her hand looks like her mother's. I lift them up and look at them with pleasure. I know my parents made me by my hands. So when she looks at her own hand, she can see a reflection of both her parents there. And you've got this sense of identity running through the poem. And remember that I said that the poem both conforms to the villanelle structure, but also rebels against it by having a slightly looser structure. And it's almost like, to me, she is mirroring, and I'm sure I read the poet talking about this, she's mirroring the kind of DNA helix, which I'm terrible at drawing, but I'll have a little go. So the idea of kind of structure, but breaking away from the structure, on one parent and another parent not quite being together. So you've got that sense of genetic identity. And the title of the poem must make us think of genes, mustn't it, and DNA. Notice that you've got end stop here. So she's content with this at this point. They are here with me. They're in my fingers. They're in my hand. End stop. It's a kind of, declaration that she and her parents are united, and that punctuation there at the end stop of the line really emphasises that. At the end of this line, she uses a dash, which again is quite unusual at the end of a line of poetry, so that must be significant. And here I think the dash indicates something that she's not saying. I look at them with pleasure, I know my parents made me, but in the next stanza we find out that the parents have actually been separated. So there's a sense there that she's not really telling us the whole truth. That dash signifies an absence. And then she goes on to be a little bit more honest with the reader. They may have been repelled to separate lands, to separate hemispheres, may sleep with other lovers. Now, notice here that she uses this modal verb, may, this modifier. I'll write that down for you here. So these are little words that kind of change or modify the meaning of the verb. So it's almost like she's not quite accepting that they're permanently separated. They may have been, separated like this. It may be that they'll get back together. But she does emphasise, in contrast, the fact that they are really, really separate. They're not just in separate lands, they're in separate hemispheres. So quite literally it seems as if the parents have moved to different parts of the world. So there's hyperbole there, perhaps. I mean, it may be truthful, perhaps her mum's gone to live in Australia, I don't know, but it seems hyperbolic, doesn't it? She's saying they're both together in her hands, they touch where fingers link to palms, but this hyperbolic suggestion that they're actually physically and spiritually completely separate as well. But she uses the villanelle refrain here. The refrain is a repeated line to emphasise that as far as she's concerned, she still connects them. I think there's a little pun here as well about hands. Hands are obviously really significant in terms of identity. The idea of making someone by hand makes her sound like a kind of delicate artifact, doesn't it? She treasures the fact that their parents have created her, and she can see that in her hands. So you've got a pun there, a bit of word play. And then in the third stanza, she moves on to talk about how the parents' separation is actually affecting other people, not just the parents themselves, because she talks about how their friends, the friends of the parents, quarry for their image. Now, quarry is got to be significant. That's a really interesting choice of word, and it means hunt. In the way that you might hunt for a fox, or an animal might hunt for something. So there is a sense there, I think, of desperation. She's emphasising how desperately sad everybody is that these parents have separated, and they're looking for them everywhere, and they're looking for them to be together. Now, this may be a bit of a stretch, but she talks about how the friends are quarrying for their image in a river, almost like they're looking for a reflection. So I think there's a couple of things they could say about that. What I mean is, if you look into a river, you're looking at a reflection in the water, aren't you? So firstly, are the friends actually seeking parts of the parents that aren't real? You know, are they looking for a fake image of what the parents were really like? Was their relationship based on something fake, and now the truth has come out and the friends can't find them? But it also makes me think of the Greek myth of Narcissus, the young man who was very, very beautiful, but also very vain. And he spent so long gazing at his own reflection in a river that he fell in and drowned. So is she making a point about, the parents' narcissism? Now, remember that I said as well that genetics is about, villanelle, tend to be about obsession. So did they have quite an obsessive relationship? And is this picked up here in this image of people looking for them in a river? And then she goes on again with this refrain, at least I know their marriage by my hand. She is the only person, this little modifier here, at least I know, shows that she feels she's the only person now really who's got a connection with them. She then goes on to use this image of the poem that I mentioned at the beginning, and she is, in doing that, talking about how she feels that their marriage had a kind of religious binding quality to it. They were married in a church, and she's reminding of them that there. And when she turns her hands over, when she's doing that little poem, again she can see this refrain, that her parents are represented in her fingers and her palms. And notice here how these stanzas have been end stopped with a firm conclusion, and here though we get enjambment, and the stanzas run one into the other. So again, here she's emphasizing that connection between them. And the poem seems to pick up here to me in tone and get a little bit more emphatic or desperate. Emphatic means when you are feeling something and expressing it very, very strongly. So this enjambment here between these two stanzas to me expresses that she's really starting to feel quite upset about this separation. My palms demur before a priest reciting psalms. My body is their marriage register. I reenact their wedding with my hands. So when she does this little poem, perhaps with a child or just for herself, she is reminding herself that their marriage should have been binded by religion. And here we can hear, I think, in the tone, her distress. Then she says in the quatrain, a complete change of address. She's now addressing a partner, perhaps a husband or other partner. Take me with you, take up the skin's demands. And notice that she addresses them in an imperative, in a command. So there's a real sense of almost, take me with you, get me away from here. She wants to now move forward into a new life, to stop obsessing about her parents, and to move forward into her own future. I'll bequeath my fingers if you bequeath my palms. Bequeath meaning to leave something to someone after you've died. So she realises now that she might mirror this pattern in her own life. She's now going to go forward, perhaps have children, and her fingers and her partner's palms will be replicated in those of the children. Now, there's two ways you could look at that, of course, couldn't you? That it's a good thing that you're going to get this genetic replication, shows you're a family, but equally, is she worrying that she will follow the pattern of her parents' marriage and end up separating? And I do think there's a little dark undertone in this last line. We know our parents make us by our hands. So there's an almost monotone quality and an end stop again to that line, which I think suggests an undertone of anxiety, perhaps. I think she, throughout the poem, is desperate for her parents to get back together. And you get that in the perfect rhyme and the refrain and the repeating ideas of wanting them to be together again. But she also knows it's unlikely to happen. So the half rhymes that I mentioned, like river and lover, show that they are fractured and that this is unlikely to happen. And I really like the way she uses the form to express this. She conforms to the form to show how obsessed she is with her parents' marriage, but she detracts from the form, moves away from the traditional structure in order to show variance, firstly in the way that was happened, but she's also thinking there about genetic variance, isn't she? She's thinking about the fact that although our bodies repeat parts of our parents' bodies, that we actually have variance and nothing will ever be quite the same as the way our parents did it. So it's a really interesting poem. It looks very simple, but it explores identity in quite a complex way, and equally the way that she uses rhyme and the way that she uses structure is quite complex as well.